Alrighty, so today we are going to talk about 10 things that we learned, highlights, and surprise of the 2022 MLS season because while the season is over, I want to talk about some of the highlights and some of the things that we learned from this season and what, of course, has changed, and obviously, once again, talk about some of the surprises that we had in the 2022 MLS season. And we start off with the first thing that we learned, and that, of course, is money can't buy success. And this has been kind of a phrase that is kind of started to become a bit of a cliche where sometimes you can't just simply buy a championship. Now, obviously, I know there's going to be people who say, well, LAFC kind of did that. I mean, when you look at the amounts that they spent during the summer transfer window and even during the last winter transfer window, and eventually won an MLS Cup. Isn't that an example of money basically sometimes can actually buy you some success? Well, in some way, yes, but when you look at some of the spendings that they had and the contribution that they had this season, most of those guys that contribute this season and are big name player has already been with this team and weren't actually coming from the winter and summer transfer window, especially in the summer transfer window, because I think besides maybe Dennis Bwanga, who really started to show out in the latter part of the season, none of their summer transfer kind of target or signings have really made a big impact. I mean, Gareth Bale didn't really make a big impact in this team, except, you could argue in that MLS Cup he did score probably the most important goal in LAFC franchise history of tying the game up, and then of course from the penalty spot, and then of course Chiellini didn't even play in the MLS Cup and was mostly there just for experience, or maybe just for there to kind of almost be like an assistant head coach and trying to basically use as a locker room presence. And when you also look at some of the big name player that contribute, guys like Carlos Vela, Chicho Arango, all those guys have already been with this team. So the bottom line is that LAFC, if you thought that they of course bought this championship, nope, it's not the case. It's been years of building, and also some of the signings that they made this offseason turns out to be a big hit. I mean, some of those underrated signing like getting Ilie and getting Ryan Townsend and even getting Maxime Crepeau, those signings weren't really big money signing, but signings that turns out to be a big hit. And I think that's just kind of perfectly transitional of what I'm trying to say, is the fact that sometimes it's not about spending the most to of course be successful. And a great example of that is you see what's going on with Atlanta United and Toronto FC, two teams that have been not shy away in terms of spending amount. In fact, they're the two highest spending team in MLS, and neither of those teams even made it to the playoffs, or even came close to making the playoffs. Now, granted, yes, Atlanta, they did had to battle in injuries this season, but when you just look at all the signings that they made, and really when you look at Atlanta and the amount of spending that they have, none of those spending and none of those big moves that they made have really kind of paid off ever since maybe the Miguel Almiron signing. I mean, that really is kind of an outlier, or at least now started to become a really big outlier of them able to successfully develop a player down in South America and sell them all for a big profit. And then of course they definitely took a huge hit with getting Joseph Martinez, and he turns out to be a force of nature until just this past couple of years. And also when you look at TFC again, they bought a lot of talent, especially on the attacking end. And well, guys like Lorenzo Insigne and Federico Bernardeschi at times definitely turned this league of their own. Not spending enough in terms of fixing their defense was a huge issue, and that again, when you're of course spending, you need to be smart in terms of spending. You can't just open your wallets and just wildly spend money and hope that of course it sticks, because we've seen time and time again where we have seen teams try to do that, and time again it just have not been worked, because there either isn't enough chemistry in the team, or the fact that most of those big signings puts a lot of pressure on a lot of these guys that come into the league, that they need to perform, and they don't perform in a way that it turns out to be a huge flop. And then, of course, the second thing that we learned from this season is part of MLS 2.0 philosophy of bring well-known player out of Europe is back. And what that means is that we definitely know some of these well-known players that play in Europe that of course have come to MLS. Guys like Gareth Bale, Jorginho, Chiellini coming into MLS. I mean, I knew that for a while. We knew that Gareth Bale, there was a chance that he could come to MLS, though I didn't think that this was going to be the year to do so. And also, you could argue guys like even Lorenzo Insigne coming to MLS and even Benedetti coming into MLS, two guys that are a heartbeat of the attack of the Italian national team coming into MLS. That is something that, again, we saw a lot of this during the MLS 2.0 era, where some of the big name player from Europe, even though they're kind of winding down their career, they come in to MLS to get their last paycheck, and at times, sometimes it of course work well. That of course does not work nowadays, and I've mentioned before how we have really moved away from that era where you can't just simply sign a player that is way past his prime and expect to be still a main key contributor in this league, because this league has definitely gone more physical and more demanding, and we've seen the improvement in terms of quality, especially from the youngster department of this league. That you just simply cannot just think about using the MLS 2.0 philosophy and hope that it works. But at least it's definitely interesting to see that we still have some big name player occasionally made into MLS. And again, I know that's going to be giving a lot of those Euro stuff some recipe in terms of saying that, well, MLS is basically a retirement league because of it. No, MLS is not a retirement league anymore. And when you look at some of the well-developed talent that this league has provided, there is no way in the world this league is considered to be a retirement league than what we consider maybe about 5 or even 10 years ago. Second thing that we learned in some of the highlights is Seattle conquering the CCL Mountain. So we said it many times before for the past couple of seasons. Is this finally the year that an MLS team conquered the CCL Mountain? And it turns out this finally was the year with the Seattle Sounders, of course, conquering that mountain. Now, obviously, it did definitely come up with a big price with the way that I'll talk about in just a bit, where they becoming the first time ever this season that they of course did not make it to the playoffs in franchise history. But if you're a Sounders fan, and I'm pretty sure deep in mind the Sounders would take that any time of the day, because even though yes, it sucks the fact that the streak eventually come to an end in terms of the longest active playoff streak, you're able to do something that no other MLS team has been done, and it's been something that's been a huge discussion in the MLS community for the past couple years of, is this finally going to be the moment where an MLS team is going to conquer the CONCACAF peak? And the fact that the Sounders were able to do it, and now the fact that they could potentially be in the FIFA Club World Cup, that's something that a lot of MLS team kind of dream to be. Because imagine if Seattle gets to play against Real Madrid in the Club World Cup. I mean, that would be just absolutely mental. But in order to do that, they need to of course win CCL, and they did exactly that. And again, I think they'll take that 100%, even if that means that they might end up not making the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. But now the other thing that was kind of a highlight and a surprise is Cincinnati finally off the wooden spoon table. And not only that, but they also made it to the playoffs in their first time in franchise history. And again, like I said, when you look at the Cincinnati team, I had a feeling this team was going to get better, especially under Pat Nolan, where he of course, I had a good feeling he was going to get this team better than what we've seen in the past couple of years. What I didn't think is that this team would basically overachieve in every single department to a level where they actually got themselves into the playoffs, and not only got themselves into the playoffs, but also won a playoff game. Like, that is something that I don't think any Cincinnati fans, even the most optimistic Cincinnati fans, will say that was the scenarios that could happen in the beginning of the season. Like, a good season for Cincinnati is just simply not finish dead last again and not win the wooden spoon for the 4th year in a row. And again, time and time again, I have given a lot of credit of what Pat Nolan has done, and especially the team that Chris Albright has built, which again, when you look at this team, it's not really that different from the one from last season. And yes, they definitely got more reinforcement in the summer transfer window, but still, this team was already performing well before those summer reinforcement has had. And again, a lot of that has to give credit to Pat Nolan. He is working wonders in terms of really getting this team to a level that, again, as I said, I don't think even the most optimistic Cincinnati fans will say that this was going to be the result of what we saw after this year. And then, of course, the other thing that we learned and that was a highlight and surprise of this 2022 MLS season is the Supporter Shield curse kind of took a pause this season. So I talked about the Supporter Shield curse and how in previous year it definitely was kind of the case, especially in these last two playoffs of whoever won the Supporter Shield, they get eliminated in the first round of the playoffs. That was not the case this season, as LAFC, of course, winning the Supporter Shield, which is great for them, but is also kind of looked like it was going to be a curse with them knowing the fact that there hasn't been a MLS Cup winner that has won the Supporter Shield at the same time since 2017, and really there's only been like two in the past 13 years or so. Well, now it's going to be free in the past 13 years or so, with LAFC joining their intercity rival, the Galaxy, and Toronto FC being the only team to win the Supporter Shield and win MLS Cup, and pretty much doing a domestic double in the past 15 years or so. And yeah, again, it's something that's a huge achievement for LAFC, because again, the pressure of winning the Supporter Shield, and just the pressure of the fact that when playoff comes, you need to of course make sure you're also at its best, and not to mention the fact that this is also single elimination, and that I think that makes it even more impressive, the fact that because this is single elimination, and unlike I think in 2017 when it was still kind of a two-legged affair, I thought this was something we probably won't see for a while because of the wackiness and just the amount of gimmicks that we've seen in the playoffs nowadays. But that's just not the case for LAFC, and especially with the expectation that they had an MLS Cup or bust kind of season, we've seen so many times where teams had that kind of ambition and it flame out spectacularly. That's not the case for LAFC, and you got to give a lot of credit of them doing that. Though, that being said, in terms of the playoffs this season, another thing that I learned is that there wasn't really many true upsets and eventful moment in the playoffs. I mean, yes, we did have MLS Cup, and yes, I mentioned before in the review of MLS Cup, it feels like, with the way that there hasn't been a lot of eventful kind of moments, and it's been mostly kind of predictable. It seems like the MLS gods or whoever, or even if you want to go into conspiracy theories from whoever is controlling MLS is basically trying to make sure that the final game is going to be the most spectacular shit show and also just craziness we'll ever seen in a cup final ever. Because besides that, when you look at most of these games, there wasn't really a lot of games that you could say that, wow, this was a playoff game that we remember for a very long time. I mean, maybe besides El Tráfico, I don't recall any of these games that you could say, wow, that was definitely a great moment. I mean, you can maybe say the Eastern Conference Final, but then, that was just kind of one where we kind of knew that the Union, once they, of course, score some quick goals, they're going to be an absolute buzzsaw. And not to mention, talk about the upset. Again, there wasn't really a lot of it because there wasn't a lot of road teams that were able to win those games. And not to mention, this is the first time since 2003 where we have two number one seeds from both conferences make it to MLS Cup. So as a result of that, that there wasn't a lot of upset, and it wasn't even like we have like a 1v7 seed. It was like 1v4, 1v2 kind of situation. So yeah, in terms of if you want absolute chaos in the MLS playoffs, this year was definitely not one of those, unless if you look at MLS Cup. But if you wanted one that you just simply want the best team to, of course, advance and eventually win the whole thing, then this, of course, is the one that you're excited about, because I think both of these teams, LAFC and the Philadelphia Union, we knew that coming into the playoffs that both of these teams looked like they could be on the collision course of making MLS Cup, and exactly that is the case. Now, speaking of playoffs, no Cascadia team made it in the playoffs. Now, last year, we had this interesting pattern where no Texas or California team made it to the playoffs, which I think that was the first time that has ever happened in league history. This year, we have the pattern of no Cascadia team made it to the playoffs for the first time in team history. And again, I really thought that was a huge surprise, considering the fact that even in the Cascadia derby between the Timbers and the Sounders, in that crucial matchup back in August, I thought one of these teams was going to make it, and one of those teams that is going to make it is the winner of the Cascadia derby. And since the Timbers were able to win it, I thought for a while that they were going to be the one to potentially do it, but no, that turns out that was not the case. The Timbers, of course, got knocked out on decision day in what kind of was an unofficial play in kind of tournament on decision day in the Western Conference. And yeah, as a result, no Cascadia team in the playoffs. We already talked about the Sounders missing out on the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. And then Vancouver basically doing Vancouver things, also missing out in the playoffs. And yeah, again, no Cascadia team mean it, which means that this was really the first time in the last 8 years that we will actually had a new champion in the Western Conference that is not named the Portland Timbers and the Seattle Sounders. And in terms of parity wise, I guess maybe it's a good thing, but at the same time, again, it's just weird the fact that this season there was no Cascadia team that made it. And it's not also because of the fact that there was a huge downturn in the Cascadia region. There was still some talent in that Cascadia region. Like the Timbers and Sounders, they were still considered to be very decent team, and even the Whitecaps last season making the playoffs, and that there was a lot of future under Vanni Sartini. So it was a huge surprise that none of them were able to make it this year too. And then the next thing that we learned, and this is kind of something that is not new, but I had to bring it up just because of the fact that, yeah, I'm gonna once again moan about the inconsistency with the refereeing and VAR, and talk about how many times where we've seen this season some crucial blown calls that could lead to big problem. And again, in the playoffs, for the most part, we kind of didn't have that, although, again, you could argue in that Western Conference final game that there was that one moment where it should have been a penalty for Austin FC. And again, if that was given a penalty, Austin get one back. Who knew how the game, of course, would turn? It would definitely not be 3-0 in favor of LAFC if you believe. Well, actually, it won't be 3-0 because if Austin converts it, it will be at the very least maybe 3-1 after the end of the game. But again, just the inconsistency refereeing continue to plague this league. How many times I've mentioned in the review of some bad refereeing decision, and not to mention VAR things. And again, overall, nowadays, I just kind of getting to a point where I almost kind of accept the fact it is kind of just the reality, and I kind of don't want to do that, because that's kind of what pro wants you to do. They want you to accept that that's kind of the reality, and that's the best we can get in terms of how to do well in terms of making the correct call. And that's exactly not what we want to do, because the refereeing in this league continue to be below standard. And again, at the end of the day, I don't want I'm not asking just for a perfect world where every decision is going to be correct and every VAR call is going to be correct, because again, in a perfect world that of course would be the case, but we're not in a perfect world right now. But at the very least, when you look at the standards that's been set in terms of refereeing and VAR usage in MLS, I mean, it's just, it hasn't been better. If you could even argue maybe have gone worse than when it was first implemented in terms of VAR all the way back in 2018. And then the next thing that we learned, and something that was a highlight and surprise of the 2022 MLS season, is Miami getting a stadium plan. And well, actually not just a stadium plan, but also a stadium deal. And this is kind of something that you know that was definitely a big question, and that a lot of people thought that Miami was going to be in an NYCFC situation, a team that promised that they're going to build a stadium. And it turns out that, of course, was not the case. But at least in Miami case, they at least do have kind of a temporary soccer-specific stadium. And, I, of course, have been to Drive Pink Stadium. And I thought that even for a temporary stadium, that's actually a very good temporary stadium. But the fact that they have a stadium deal, and the fact that they got the approval from the Miami City Council, something that a lot of people was very skeptical, and that, again, with all the lawsuit that was going on in the Freedom Park site, it just didn't look like that was going to happen. But the fact that it did happen, you got to give a lot of credit to Inter Miami, and certainly David Beckham and the Moss brothers in terms of finally getting that over the hurdle. And that at least they kind of gladly say that at least they're not like another NYCFC who is still to this day still searching in terms of the whole stadium issue that they've been dealing for the past 7 years or now. And then lastly, the other thing the last thing that we learned from this season is the attendance have rebounded. Not really to a normal level yet, because you definitely did see some attendance drop throughout the league. In fact, pretty much every team suffered attendance drop, but it's getting to a point where, in terms of those attendance drop, it wasn't as much as what we saw in 2021. Well, that's because back then we were still in a COVID year, and as we're now, started to kind of getting, I wouldn't say we're now at post-pandemic, because, people forget that we're still technically in a pandemic right now, but the restriction has been a lot looser than what we've seen when the pandemic started back in 2020. But it feels like we're now at a stage where this is kind of like the new normal, and that, you know, the attendance, it has definitely rebounded to a level where, you know, we have seen stadiums that has been packed to the rafter, like what we saw doing pre-pandemic level. And also, not to mention the fact that we also reached the all-time high in terms of total attendance. Now, obviously, that's not a big surprise, because when you add another team into the list, you're going to have a good chance to break that attendance. And I have a feeling that's going to continue into next season too, because now with St. Louis coming into the league and knowing the fact that it looks like St. Louis is going to sell out pretty much every single other game with the amount of season ticket deposit that they had in their team, yeah, I think the attendance is just going to continue to go up to a level where, yeah, it started getting back to the normal. And that, I mean, I will say that the attendance have started to kind of flatline a little bit at around 20,000 plus, but, you know, that was kind of expected, because, you know, most of these soccer specific stadium is around that range, and the fact that, you know, we are averaging for some teams that we are averaging around that, and for the most part we are seeing those stands being filled. I mean, that's definitely such a great moment to see, because, you know, I mean, we did see some of that in near the end of 2021, as many teams pretty much lift the restriction and have full capacity. But again, this year was really the first year where we feel like we're back to where we were before the pandemic but began, where every single team at least are operating at full capacity. And in some stadium, they were not only operating at full capacity, but it was packed to the rafter, just like what we see before the pandemic all happened in 2020. But there we have it. That is pretty much it in terms of looking at the 10 things that we learned, highlights, and surprise of the 2022 MLS season. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? And as always, let me know in the comments below, what are some of the things that you learned from this 2022 MLS season. But until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.